your heart has like a set rate that it wants to beat at. Anybody that's had kids, you might have noticed that a kiddo's heartbeat beats much faster than an adult's heartbeat. Even like my little kids, my 6-year-old, right? Her heartbeat is a little bit faster. Why does that happen? So the resting rate of the heart is kind of like somewhere between 100 and 120-ish. Right? That's where it wants to be with no brain connected. And then once you start attaching the brain to it, what the brain does is it uses that parasympathetic output and it slows it down. Heart rate is a function of how well you maintain blood pressure. So if I'm really efficient at it, I don't have to beat my heart as much to maintain pressure, which is pretty cool. And so I can have that parasympathetic system slow my heart down even more because that uses less energy and it's more efficient for my body, which is pretty great. Now, if I want to like get up real quick, I don't have to really do a lot to like hammer down and hit the gas pedal and get the sympathetic system going. I don't really have to do that. All I can do is just let off the brakes of the parasympathetic system, and that heart will be like, let me run, and it'll start to raise up toward that 100 to 120 mark, right? Which is pretty cool. In that range, like 100 to 120, I don't really have to do much. That I just back off the parasympathetic inhibition, and that heart rate will naturally climb up into that range. Then if I want to crank, I'm back on the soccer field again, and I want to take it even above that 120 mark. Now I can shift over and I can push in that sympathetic drive. And now I can have that heart crank even more. Allows me to take it up from that like 120 range up into the 170 range, let's call it. So if we think about somebody with POTS, when I'm looking at them, there's a difference between somebody who, when they pop up, is going from, 70 to 120. That's still 50 points different, right? So it's still a big jump. But there's a little different physiology happening than if they take it to 150. Because now I've had to introduce a new signal to the mix, right? So I've had to do a different physiology to get there. And those things, they seem subtle and they're like, oh, cool. But they really matter in terms of like how your body is trying to solve for this problem and to what end. Same thing if my heart rate starts if it's cruising around 100, then I know that is a very different thing than if it starts at 65, 70. It means that like my ability to provide that inhibition to the heart is either not working or my brain has decided that we shouldn't do that in order to maintain the state that we are in. At the end of it, what are the basics here? The autonomic system really comes down to energy. It's how do we make it, how do we mobilize it, and how do we make it efficient and recoverable so that when we expend energy, then we can also replenish the system that allows us to recover quickly so we can spend it again. And that would be like, I would move people away from thinking about it in terms of rest and digest and fight or flight, and I would move it toward thinking about it in terms of how much energy am I using? Is that efficient? So if I'm cranking 120 just to like eat an orange on the couch, that's not efficient. And so then we have to back out of like, well, why does my body have to do that to be able to maintain this status? Are there things that I can do so that my body can be more efficient, so that I'm not burning all of this energy in order to do really simple tasks? Doru asked, what do we do to help her improve? So in this particular case, we're looking at doing kind of a correlate effort. So it's not one thing. It's a combination of eye-head stimulus, so coordinating eye-head movement, but also with proprioceptive stimulation through neck afferents while we're creating that movement so that we kind of orient to our head better. So underneath this is where we're seeing this proprioceptive error in the control of head and neck function. And just said simply, and by recalibrating for that, improving that signal ratio, then the brain's actually able to organize blood flow better. And so it controls it better. So the way to think about it, it's harder to talk about in blood pressure terms because that's a harder motor pattern. But the same way you could take someone that might have a problem with like accurately putting, their finger on your nose or pinning the tail on the donkey. But by training the brain so they understand where their hand is better, then it makes it way easier to do that task, right? So same idea. We want to make sure that we're understanding where we are. And part of the benefit of that output is that it's tied to the reflexes of our autonomic outputs. So that's just kind of a quick synopsis of that. Jesse asks, does norepinephrine raise normal for some people with POTS? Is it normal? I'm going to assume the question here is it normal for epinephrine to go up with people in POTS? So norepinephrine, we just talked about sympathetic nerves, right? So norepinephrine is what that nerve uses at the end. So we send an electrical signal from one end of the nerve to the other. And then at the end of that, it releases a little chemical to the next nerve, and that starts the electricity at the next nerve, and then it goes. So that chemical that gets released where those two nerves butt up against each other, in a sympathetic nerve, that one's called norepinephrine. So it really only exists in this little cleft right here. But if you have to really crank that out in order to maintain blood flow to your head, then you're going to have more production or more utilization of norepinephrine at that nerve ending that we can measure, and then you can see that go up. The thing that confuses people sometimes, though, is we think of norepinephrine as the same thing as epinephrine, and then that's, or adrenaline that's produced in the adrenal glands, and they're not the same. They have a similar name. It's confusing, but it's not the same. One is a metabolic hormone, helps us to be able to release glucose better. So it helps us pull glucose out of the liver, out of the muscles, out of the blood supply, and it helps us to be able to use glucose. Whereas norepinephrine goes between those two nerve endings so that one sympathetic nerve can talk to the next one in the line. Okay, so those are the difference. And they can go up, and they should go up if we're seeing an acceleration of vasoconstriction, if we're seeing increases in heart rate, if we're seeing changes in respiration, right? We talked about that lung activity. So all of those things may possibly yield higher levels of norepinephrine simply because you're trying to crank it out more. Just like if you were stomping on the gas pedal and you had more exhaust coming out of the tailpipe because you're burning more. So that might be a good way to think about it, Jesse. Dual tasking, what does it mean? So a dual task is basically a term that we use to describe a cognitive task that is coupled to another context. So we may do it when people are walking or when they're doing a certain manual task, or in this case, when they're on a tilt test. We don't always tell you what they are because we don't want you to try to prepare for them, but it's just a mental task, a cognitive task that we have you do so that we can see when you're trying to think, does the system respond the same way or does it change? And that part's what we're looking at here. So when you saw the case we looked at today, the cerebral perfusion went up during the dual task, which is great because it means when the brain demanded more energy, the body was able to fulfill that demand, which is fantastic. And one of the things that really helped in this case. But in some cases, when you go to do that, we actually see it drop. And in these sense, we know that the metabolic capacity is not as good. Are there any options for people at home to monitor without wearables? You'll have to do manual recordings. And it depends on what you're trying to measure, I suppose, too, or if it's valuable to measure any of these things. Those would be the first two questions. But to measure like heart rate, blood pressure, just simple pulse ox, or an automated blood pressure cuff, those things are reasonable. It's mostly stuff that is like transmitting to your phone or getting a constant signal all the time, that if that's something you're concerned about, then you may not want to do that.